In the shadowed halls of medieval castles, where power and cruelty danced hand in hand, there lived souls whose very existence was a testament to humanity's capacity for both laughter and unimaginable suffering. This is their story. If you use these videos to fall asleep, subscribe so you don't miss any new ones. Leave a comment with your thoughts on the video and any suggestions you have for future ones. Not the romanticized tale of wit and wisdom, but the brutal reality of those who wore the motley and bore the bells, trading their humanity for a chance at survival in a world that saw them as less than human. The morning mist still clung to the village fields when young Willem felt the heavy hand fall upon his shoulder. He had been drawing water from the well, as he did every dawn before his work in the Lord's fields began, when the mounted figure appeared through the fog like a specter of fate. The nobleman's eyes, cold and calculating, studied Willem's hunched back and withered left arm. With the same detached interest one might examine livestock at market. "This one will do," the Lord declared to his retinue, as if Willem were not standing there, trembling with the bucket still clutched in his good hand. "Take him." Willem's protests died in his throat as rough hands seized him. His mother's wails echoed across the village square, but no one dared intervene when nobility claimed what they desired. This was the reality of medieval recruitment. Not volunteers seeking fame and fortune, but human beings plucked from their lives like fruit from a tree, their differences weaponized for the amusement of those who held absolute power over life and death. The transformation began immediately. Willem's rough peasant clothes were stripped away and replaced with a garment that would become both his identity and his prison: the motley. The patchwork fabric, bright yellows and reds that seemed to mock his pallor, hung loose on his thin frame. The cap, adorned with jingling bells that would announce his presence and mark his shame, was forced upon his head with such roughness that his ears rang. As the cart carried him away from everything he had ever known, Willem understood with crystal clarity that his childhood had ended in that moment beside the well. He was no longer a person with a name, a family, a future of his own choosing. He was now property, a curiosity to be paraded before nobles for their entertainment. The bells on his cap sang a mournful song with each jolt of the cart wheels, a funeral dirge for the life that was already becoming memory. But Willem's story was far from unique. In castle after castle across Europe, similar scenes played out with horrifying regularity. Across the Channel in France, a young man named Nicolas Ferriol, known to history as Triboulet, had already learned what awaited those marked by difference. Born with microcephaly, his small head and distinctive appearance had caught the eye of nobles who saw entertainment value in his condition. His bowed back, his short and twisted legs, his long and hanging arms, amused the ladies, who contemplated him as if he had been a monkey or a paraquet. The deliberate dehumanization was complete. He existed not as Nicholas, but as a thing to be observed and laughed at. In England, Geoffrey Hudson's fate was sealed at the tender age of 7, when the Duke of Buckingham discovered him and decided to make him part of an elaborate entertainment. The child was smuggled into a large pie, from which he would leap out to surprise and amuse the royal audience. That moment of theatrical birth marked the death of his autonomy. He would spend the rest of his life performing on command, his very body a stage for others' amusement. The recruitment methods varied, but the result was always the same: the systematic erasure of personhood. Some jesters were war captives, literally gifted between nobles as human presence wrapped in bells and colorful clothing. Others were born into families too poor to resist when nobility demanded their different children. The cruelest irony was that many were taken under the guise of Christian charity, nobles claiming to provide for the unfortunate while using them as human entertainment. The journey to the castle was itself a form of psychological torture. Jester recruits were paraded through villages and towns, their new costumes marking them as something other than human. Children pointed and laughed. Adults shook their heads in mixture of pity and relief that it was not their child taken. By the time they reached their destination, many had already internalized their new status as objects of ridicule, rather than subjects deserving dignity. Willem's first glimpse of his new home struck him like a physical blow. The castle rose from the landscape like a great stone beast, its towers clawing at the gray sky. What he saw contradicted every tale he had heard of noble grandeur. This was no palace of wonder, but a monument to human misery disguised as strength. The massive walls that promised protection from external enemies offered no sanctuary from the horrors within. As Willem was dragged through the gates, the assault on his senses began immediately. The stench hit him first, a nauseating mixture of human waste, rotting food, animal dung, and the acrid smoke that seemed to permeate every stone. The sound followed, a cacophony of coughing, retching, and the constant scurrying of unseen creatures in the walls. The great hall, where he would spend most of his waking hours, was a cavern of perpetual twilight. Tiny windows, designed more for defense than illumination, allowed only meager light to penetrate the gloom. What little warmth existed came from primitive fireplaces that filled the air with thick, choking smoke. Without proper chimneys, the smoke had nowhere to escape, creating a toxic atmosphere that left everyone with the telltale castle cough, a harsh, persistent hack that would plague Willem for the rest of his days. But it was the cold that truly defined castle life. The massive stone walls, impressive though they appeared, were thermal prisons that trapped the chill and held it like a vice. Medieval building techniques were primitive, and insulation was non-existent. In winter, the temperature inside often barely differed from the frigid courtyard. Willem would learn to sleep curled into a tight ball, his thin body shaking uncontrollably as frost formed on the inside of windows, and his breath created clouds of vapor that lingered in the still air. The sleeping arrangements revealed the true hierarchy of suffering within these walls. Nobles retired to chambers that, while still cold and damp, at least offered privacy and marginally better conditions. Important guests might receive feather mattresses and heavy blankets. But for servants, guards, and especially jesters, comfort was a luxury denied. Willem found himself assigned a space in what could generously be called the servants' quarters, a long, low room where dozens of bodies were packed together on straw pallets that served as beds. These mattresses were little more than woven straw and rushes laid directly on the stone floor, changed perhaps a few times per year if he was fortunate. The straw quickly became infested with fleas, lice, and other parasites that made sleep a torment of constant itching and scratching. Privacy was an alien concept. Men, women, and children of various ages and positions shared the same sleeping spaces. The boundaries between personal space dissolved into a mass of humanity, pressed together for warmth, creating an environment where disease spread with devastating efficiency. When someone fell ill, which happened frequently, their sickness quickly became everyone's sickness. The floor beneath the straw was covered with rushes, reeds scattered to absorb the constant moisture and provide a walking surface. But these rushes, rarely changed and never properly cleaned, became repositories of horror. Bones from meals, vomit from the sick, animal excrement tracked in from the courtyards, scraps of rotting food, and human waste all accumulated in the rushes. The smell was so overwhelming that even the hardened castle dwellers moved quickly through certain areas, breathing through their mouths to avoid the worst of it. Willem soon discovered that the castle's very structure was designed to trap not just enemies, but its own inhabitants in a cycle of disease and suffering. The thick stone walls that provided military protection also prevented proper ventilation, creating stagnant air that recycled pathogens endlessly. Moisture seeped through the stones, creating perfect conditions for black mold that grew in corners, behind tapestries, and within the very walls themselves. The inhabitants didn't understand what mold was, but they felt its effects daily. Chronic headaches, persistent fatigue, respiratory infections that never quite healed, and mysterious ailments that sapped strength and shortened lives. The water supply was equally treacherous. Wells often drew from sources contaminated by the castle's own waste systems. The primitive understanding of sanitation meant that human and animal waste frequently found its way into drinking water, spreading dysentery, typhoid, and other waterborne diseases that could kill within days. Most inhabitants learned to drink ale or watered wine instead of water, but this provided only marginal protection and added the burden of chronic mild intoxication to their daily struggles. Rats ruled the castle's hidden spaces with an authority that rivaled that of the nobles themselves. These creatures, some grown fat and bold on the abundant food scraps and waste, moved through the walls in numbers that defied imagination. They contaminated food stores, chewed through anything organic, and served as hosts for fleas that carried diseases deadly to humans. Some jesters developed an uncanny ability to predict weather changes by observing rat behavior. The creatures seemed to sense approaching storms hours before humans noticed the first clouds. The rat problem was so severe that many castles maintained armies of cats, but even these predators could not keep pace with the rodent population. Willem watched in fascination and horror as cats stalked through the halls, their eyes glowing in the dim light, engaged in an eternal war against an enemy that bred faster than it could be killed. The sounds of this nocturnal battle, squealing, hissing, and the scratch of claws on stone, provided a soundtrack to sleepless nights. Within the castle's rigid social structure, Willem quickly learned his place, and it was lower than he had ever imagined possible. He had been a peasant, certainly, but peasants had names, families, and at least the theoretical protection of custom and tradition. Jesters existed in a legal and social void, owning nothing, protected by no law, valued only for their ability to amuse. The hierarchy that governed castle life was as immutable as the stone walls themselves. At its apex sat the lord and his family, beings so elevated that they seemed to inhabit a different realm entirely. Below them, a carefully ordered cascade of nobility, knights, clergy, and administrative officials. Each knew their exact place and the privileges or restrictions that came with it. Servants occupied the lower rungs, but even they possessed rights and protections that jesters were denied. A cook might be beaten for burning the lord's meal, but he could not be killed without consequence. A stable boy might face punishment for neglecting the horses, but he remained a human being with legal standing. A seamstress might be dismissed for poor work, but she could seek employment elsewhere. Jesters existed below this entire structure, in a category that defied normal social classification. They were property, not people, assets to be maintained, displayed, or disposed of, according to their owner's whims. The legal framework that provided some protection for other social classes offered nothing for those who wore the motley. They could be beaten, sold, or killed without legal consequence. Their lives, valued less than the horses in the stable or the hunting dogs in the kennel. This dehumanization was not accidental, but systematic and deliberate. Jesters were required to participate in their own degradation, making jokes at their own expense, exaggerating their flaws, and drawing laughter by humiliating their own identities. They were expected to respond to insults with wit rather than anger, to accept abuse with humor rather than protest. Any display of normal human emotion, pain, sadness, dignity, was seen as a failure to fulfill their role. The psychological torture of this existence was perhaps more devastating than the physical hardships. Willem found himself caught in an impossible bind. To survive, he must entertain, but to entertain, he must collaborate in his own dehumanization. Every successful joke that drew laughter from the nobles was also a small death of his self-respect. Every time he made his audience laugh by mocking his withered arm or his peasant origins, he reinforced their belief that he was less than human. The other inhabitants of the castle reflected this hierarchy in their treatment of jesters. Nobles ignored them except when seeking entertainment. Knights might kick them aside like dogs if they interfered with important business. Servants, grateful for anyone below them in the social order, often took out their own frustrations on jesters with petty cruelties and casual violence. This social isolation was perhaps the cruelest aspect of jester life. Despite being constantly surrounded by people, they remained fundamentally alone. No one sought their friendship, only their performance. No one cared for their welfare beyond ensuring they remained capable of providing amusement. They were visible to everyone, yet truly seen by no one. Willem discovered that even basic human needs became sources of humiliation. When he was hungry, he was expected to entertain for his food. When he was cold, he was told to dance to warm himself. When he was sick, he was mocked for his weakness. The simple dignity of suffering in private was denied to him. Even his pain became potential material for others' amusement. The clothing he wore reinforced his status at every moment. The motley was not just a costume, but a prison uniform that marked him as different from normal humanity. The bright colors that might have seemed cheerful from a distance became symbols of his degradation up close. The bells that adorned his cap served as a constant reminder of his role. He could not move silently, could not hide, could not ever forget what he had become. The psychological pressure of living under constant observation was immense. Every word, every gesture, every expression was monitored by those who held power over life and death. A joke that fell flat might result in punishment. An inappropriate comment could mean banishment or worse. A failure to entertain when commanded could trigger violent retaliation. Willem learned to live in a state of hypervigilance, constantly reading the mood of his audience, searching for the line between acceptable humor and dangerous truth. The summons came on a gray morning when frost covered the castle walls like a shroud of death. Willem had been practicing juggling in the courtyard, his breath forming clouds in the bitter air, when the Lord's voice boomed across the stones. "Fool! Attend me." In the great hall, maps spread across tables told a story of territorial disputes and brewing war. The Lord's face was grim as he turned to Willem, and the jester felt his blood turn to ice water as he saw the parchment being held toward him. "You will carry this message to Lord Aldrich at Raven's Hollow," the Lord commanded, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. "Demand his surrender of the disputed lands or face siege." Willem's hands trembled as he accepted the sealed document, understanding immediately that he was being handed his own death warrant. He had heard the whispered stories of other jesters who had served as messengers in conflicts between nobles. Few returned, and those who did often came back as broken men, their minds shattered by what they had witnessed. The journey to Raven's Hollow took 3 days through countryside, scarred by previous conflicts. Burned farmhouses stood like blackened teeth against the gray sky, and the roads were littered with evidence of the casual violence that defined noble disputes. Vilem's motley, so distinctive and humiliating at court, now marked him as a target for any soldier or brigand who might assume he carried valuables or information. When he finally reached Raven's Hollow, Willem found a castle preparing for war. The courtyard bustled with activity as soldiers sharpened weapons and servants prepared for siege. The very air seemed to vibrate with tension and barely controlled violence. Lord Aldrich received him in a hall filled with armed men whose faces showed no mercy or humor. As Willem unfolded the message and read its contents aloud, he watched the Lord's expression darken with each word. The demands were insulting in their arrogance, designed more to provoke than to negotiate. "So," Lord Aldrich said slowly, his voice dangerously quiet, "your master thinks to threaten me with siege." Willem tried to speak, to explain that he was merely the messenger, but the words died in his throat as he saw the rage building in the Lord's eyes. Around him, the armed men shifted restlessly, hands moving toward their weapons. "Tell me, fool," Lord Aldrich continued, rising from his chair, "do you know what we do with messengers who bring insulting demands?" Before Willem could answer, the Lord gestured to his men. "Take him to the courtyard. Ready the trebuchet." The next hours were a nightmare of preparation and anticipation. Willem was dragged to the castle's siege engines, where he saw the massive wooden structure of the trebuchet being loaded with more than stones. Other messengers, or rather, their remains, were being prepared as projectiles. The sight of severed heads being placed in the machine's launching basket made Willem vomit uncontrollably. "You will carry our response back to your master," Lord Aldrich announced with cruel satisfaction. "Perhaps not in the manner you expected, but our message will be clear." As Willem was bound and prepared for launching, he could hear the soldiers placing bets on how far his body would fly. Some laughed about whether any recognizable pieces would make it back to his lord's camp. The dehumanization was complete. He had become merely another projectile, a piece of siege ammunition with the added benefit of sending a graphic message. The trebuchet that would launch Willem's broken body back to his master was a marvel of medieval engineering designed for destruction. These massive siege engines could hurl projectiles weighing over 300 pounds for distances that would amaze modern observers. The counterweight system generated tremendous force, enough to breach castle walls or, in this case, to launch human beings like grotesque cannonballs. The preparation ritual was deliberately theatrical, designed to maximize both the psychological impact on the victim and the message sent to the enemy. Willem was positioned in the launching basket, bound but still alive, forced to contemplate his approaching death, while soldiers made final adjustments to the machine. The calculation was precise. He needed to survive the launch long enough to deliver the visual message of Lord Aldrich's contempt. When the release came, Wilem's world exploded into agony and disorientation. The tremendous acceleration crushed his ribs and drove the breath from his lungs. For a brief moment, he flew through the air like a broken bird, his motley streaming behind him in a trail of bright colors against the gray sky. The impact, when it came, was mercifully quick. His body landed in his master's camp with the wet sound of meat striking earth. The message was immediately clear to all who witnessed it. Lord Aldrich's response to the demand for surrender was written in blood and broken bones. Wylam's motley, now torn and stained with gore, fluttered in the wind like a battle standard. But Willem's death was neither unique nor even particularly noteworthy in the brutal calculus of medieval warfare. Historical records document numerous instances of jesters and other messengers being catapulted back to their masters as graphic illustrations of contempt. The practice was so common that it became an expected risk of the profession. Some jesters were more fortunate, returning alive but shattered. They brought back accounts of torture and mutilation designed to terrorize their masters. Others simply vanished, their fate unknown but easily guessed. The few who completed their missions unharmed often found that survival brought its own torments. They were frequently blamed for the failure of negotiations or suspected of collaboration with the enemy. The psychological warfare aspect of these deaths was carefully calculated. The sight of a beloved entertainer's broken body delivered by siege engine sent a message more powerful than any diplomatic note. It demonstrated not just military capability, but a willingness to cross moral boundaries that might give even hardened warriors pause. The first signs appeared in early spring, when the merchant caravans from the ports brought more than goods to the castle. A sailor, pale and sweating despite the cool weather, collapsed in the courtyard after delivering wine barrels to the kitchens. By evening, he was dead, his body covered in the telltale dark swellings that marked the arrival of humanity's most terrible visitor. The Black Death had come to claim its tribute from both noble and fool alike. For jesters like Willem's successor, a young man called Thomas, who had replaced Willem after his violent end. The plague brought a unique form of horror. While other castle inhabitants could at least attempt to isolate themselves or flee to the countryside, jesters were commanded to continue their duties regardless of the danger. Their role as entertainers made them essential for maintaining morale, even as death stalked the corridors. "The Lord requires amusement in these dark times," the chamberlain announced to Thomas with cold indifference. "You will perform your duties as usual. The pestilence is God's will, and humor is the remedy for despair." Thomas found himself ordered to entertain in the very halls where corpses were being dragged away daily. He was required to make light of death itself, to find humor in the terror that gripped everyone around him. The cruel irony was not lost on him. He was expected to make people laugh while they literally died around him. The castle's already horrific sanitary conditions became exponentially worse as the plague progressed. The primitive waste systems, which had always been inadequate, became completely overwhelmed. Bodies piled up faster than they could be removed, and the stench of death mingled with the existing odors of human waste and rotting food to create an atmosphere so toxic that even breathing became an act of courage. The rats, which had always been a problem, now became harbingers of death. These creatures, fat and bold from feeding on human corpses, carried fleas that bore the plague bacillus in their blood. They scurried through the castle with impunity, spreading death with every bite from their infected parasites. Thomas learned to recognize the signs. When the rats began dying en masse, human deaths would follow within days. Sleep became impossible in the servants' quarters where Thomas was housed. The close quarters that had always bred disease now became a death trap, where infection spread with lightning speed. Those who fell ill in the night might be dead by morning, their corpses stiffening beside terrified survivors who dared not move them for fear of contagion. The straw pallets, already infested with parasites, became breeding grounds for disease. The nobles, despite their elevated position, were not immune to the pestilence. Thomas watched in fascination and terror as the rigid hierarchy of the castle began to collapse under the weight of universal mortality. Lords who had seemed godlike in their power were reduced to sweating, delirious figures, crying out for mercy from a plague that recognized no earthly authority. Yet even in their own agony, the nobles continued to demand entertainment. Thomas was summoned to perform before audiences of sick and dying aristocrats, expected to juggle and joke, while his audience coughed up blood and writhed in pain. One particularly horrific memory would haunt him forever: being ordered to perform while the Lord's young daughter lay dying just yards away, her mother weeping silently as Thomas tried to find humor in a world gone mad. The psychological toll was as devastating as the physical danger. Thomas found himself caught in an impossible situation. Failing to entertain meant punishment or death, but continuing to perform felt like a betrayal of basic human decency. He developed what would now be recognized as severe psychological trauma, experiencing nightmares, sudden panic, and periods of dissociation where he felt as if he were watching someone else wear his motley and speak his words. Food became even more dangerous than usual during the plague years. The castle's already questionable food safety practices deteriorated completely as the staff died off. Meals were prepared by whoever remained alive, often people with no knowledge of cooking or food storage. Bread molded before it could be eaten, meat rotted in the kitchens, and water sources became contaminated with runoff from mass burial sites. Thomas learned to survive on whatever scraps he could find, often competing with rats for access to any edible material. The irony was bitter. In a castle supposedly filled with wealth and abundance, he was slowly starving while surrounded by death. The Lord's demands for entertainment never ceased, even as Thomas grew weak from hunger and terror. The medical understanding of the time was woefully inadequate to combat the plague. Castle physicians, such as they were, prescribed treatments that ranged from useless to actively harmful. They recommended burning herbs to purify the air, bleeding patients to release evil humors, and consuming expensive theriac, a supposed cure-all that did nothing to slow the disease's progress. For jesters, medical care was virtually non-existent. They were expected to either recover on their own or die quietly, without disrupting the castle's routine. As the plague progressed, Thomas witnessed the complete breakdown of normal social structures. Servants abandoned their posts to flee to the countryside. Soldiers deserted their duties, and even some nobles attempted to escape. Yet jesters were chained to their roles by the very nature of their servitude. They had nowhere to go, no skills beyond entertainment, and no legal status that would protect them in the outside world. The death toll was staggering. Historical estimates suggest that the Black Death killed between 1/3 and 1/2 of Europe's population. In the confined space of a castle, where people lived in close quarters with poor sanitation, the mortality rate was often even higher. Thomas watched entire families disappear overnight, saw proud knights reduced to begging for water, and witnessed the collapse of the social order that had seemed so permanent. When the plague finally began to subside, Thomas found himself one of the few survivors in a castle that had become a charnel house. The Lord, by some miracle or curse, had survived, though many of his family and retainers had not. The demand for entertainment resumed immediately, as if nothing had happened. Thomas was expected to perform for an audience of ghosts, making jokes in halls where the dead outnumbered the living. The experience left permanent scars on those who survived. Thomas developed a persistent cough from breathing the toxic air, chronic pain from malnutrition and psychological wounds that would never fully heal. Yet he was expected to continue his role, as if the horror had never occurred. The bells on his cap still jingled merrily, but to him they sounded like funeral bells, tolling for all the dead whose names no one would remember. In the courts of medieval Europe, human difference was not celebrated or accommodated. It was commodified. Those born with physical disabilities, unusual appearance, or cognitive differences found themselves trapped in a system that transformed their very bodies into entertainment for the amusement of the powerful. Triboulet, the most famous of these exploited souls, embodied the cruel reality of how medieval society treated those it deemed different. Born Nicolas Ferial in 1479, he suffered from microcephaly, a condition that gave him a distinctively small head and often resulted in cognitive impairment. His bowed back, his short and twisted legs, his long and hanging arms, made him an object of fascination for nobles, who contemplated him as if he had been a monkey or a paraquet. The deliberate comparison to animals was not accidental, but reflected the genuine belief among the nobility that people like Triboulet existed on a spectrum somewhere between human and beast. They were seen as natural fools, beings who lacked the full capacity for human thought and emotion, making their exploitation not just acceptable, but almost charitable. The court convinced itself that providing food and shelter to such individuals was an act of Christian kindness, even as they forced them to perform degrading acts for entertainment. Geoffrey Hudson's story illustrated another dimension of this exploitation. Born with dwarfism in 1619, he was discovered at age 7 by the Duke of Buckingham, who saw entertainment potential in the child's small stature. The Duke arranged for Geoffrey to be baked into a large pie, from which he would emerge to surprise and delight the royal court. This theatrical birth, as a court curiosity, marked the beginning of a life where his body would never belong to himself. The dehumanization was systematic and complete. These individuals were often renamed or given nicknames that referenced their disabilities rather than their birth names. They were dressed in costumes that exaggerated their differences, making them appear even more unusual and amusing to their audiences. Their living conditions were often worse than those of animals. While prized hunting dogs might have comfortable kennels and regular veterinary care, disabled jesters were housed in whatever space was available and received no medical attention for their conditions. Jane the Fool, also known as Jane Fool, served multiple queens during the Tudor period, including the dangerous courts of Anne Boleyn and Mary the Fay. Her survival in such a volatile environment came at tremendous personal cost. She was required to maintain a shaved head at Queen Mary's request, stripping away even the basic dignity of personal appearance. Her uniform consisted of a cap and little else, marking her as property rather than a person with individual needs or preferences. The psychological torture inflicted on these individuals was perhaps more devastating than their physical exploitation. They were required to participate in their own dehumanization, making jokes about their disabilities, exaggerating their impairments for comic effect, and accepting abuse with apparent good humor. Any display of normal human emotions, pain, sadness, anger, or dignity, was seen as a failure to fulfill their role. Triboulet's experiences exemplified this psychological cruelty. When he complained to King Francis I about a nobleman who had threatened to beat him to death, the king's response was telling: "If he does, I will hang him a quarter of an hour afterward." The king's promise of eventual justice offered no protection in the moment, and essentially granted permission for the abuse to occur. Triboulet's witty response: "Sir, couldn't you contrive to hang him a quarter of an hour previously?" was celebrated as clever wordplay, but it masked the genuine terror of someone living under constant threat of violence. The physical abuse these individuals endured was often rationalized as part of their entertainment value. Triboulet was regularly beaten by pages and other court members who faced no consequences for their actions. The beatings were sometimes incorporated into performances, with audiences laughing at the spectacle of a disabled person being struck. The line between punishment and entertainment dissolved completely, leaving victims with no recourse or protection. Medical care for disabled jesters was virtually non-existent. Their conditions were seen as fixed and unchangeable, part of their essential nature rather than health issues that might be treated. Pain, infection, and deterioration were simply accepted as inevitable, with no effort made to provide comfort or intervention. Many died young from complications related to their disabilities that could have been prevented or treated with even basic medical knowledge. The sexual exploitation of disabled jesters was another horrific aspect of their treatment. Their perceived lack of full humanity made them vulnerable to abuse that would have been considered criminal if perpetrated against normal individuals. Women jesters were particularly vulnerable, with their disability used to justify treatment that amounted to sexual slavery. The social isolation experienced by these individuals was profound. Despite being constantly surrounded by people, they remained fundamentally alone. No one formed genuine friendships with them. Relationships were always transactional, based on their ability to provide entertainment. They could not marry without permission, could not have children who would be free, and could not hope for any life beyond their role as court curiosities. Education was deliberately withheld from many disabled jesters. Teaching them to read or write might have given them tools for independence or self-advocacy, which would have conflicted with their role as permanent dependents. They were kept in a state of artificial ignorance, their intellectual development stunted to maintain their usefulness as entertainment. The religious establishment often provided theological justification for this exploitation. Disability was viewed as either divine punishment for sin or a test of faith, making the suffering of disabled individuals part of God's plan. This religious framework made resistance not just futile, but actually sinful, as it would constitute rebellion against divine will. Some disabled jesters internalized this oppression so completely that they became willing participants in their own degradation. They learned to anticipate their audience's desires, to perform their disability in ways that maximized entertainment value. This psychological adaptation was a survival mechanism, but it came at the cost of any authentic sense of self or dignity. In the great hall of Blackmore Castle, the evening's entertainment was about to begin. The nobles had finished their meal of roasted peacock and honeyed wine, and now they turned their attention to more refined pleasures. The systematic humiliation of another human being. Marcus, the current jester, stood before them in his motley, the bells on his cap catching the flickering light from the torches. He had held this position for 2 years, a remarkably long tenure that spoke more to luck than skill. Tonight, however, his fortune was about to run out in the most spectacular fashion. "Tell us, fool," called out Lord Blackmore, his voice already thick with wine. "What do you think of my new bride?" The question was a trap, and Marcus knew it immediately. Lady Blackmore sat beside her husband, her face a mask of aristocratic composure, but her eyes held a warning. She was barely 16, married to a man 4 times her age, and already the subject of whispered rumors about her premarital conduct. Any answer Marcus gave would be wrong. "My lord," Marcus began carefully, I think she is like a summer day, bright, warm, and greatly appreciated by all who encounter her." The hall erupted in laughter, but not the kind that would save him. The nobles recognized the double meaning immediately. Marcus had essentially called the new bride a woman of easy virtue. Lord Blackmore's face darkened with rage. "Guards!" the lord roared, rising from his chair. "Seize the insolent fool!" What followed was a carefully orchestrated performance of violence designed to entertain the assembled nobility. Marcus was dragged to the center of the hall, where a whipping post had been installed specifically for such occasions. His motley was stripped away, revealing a body already scarred from previous entertainments. The whipping began slowly, each stroke timed for maximum dramatic effect. The audience watched with rapt attention, some placing bets on how long Marcus would remain conscious. His screams provided a soundtrack to their enjoyment, punctuated by laughter and encouraging shouts for the flogger to strike harder. But the physical punishment was only the beginning of the evening's entertainment. As Marcus hung bleeding from the post, Lord Blackmore announced the next phase of the proceedings. "Since our fool seems to enjoy making observations about virtue," the Lord declared, "perhaps he would benefit from a closer examination of the subject." Marcus was cut down and dragged to a brazier where iron rods had been heating in the coals. The practice of branding prisoners and criminals was common, but branding a jester for entertainment was a refinement that demonstrated the complete erasure of any human rights. The smell of burning flesh filled the hall as the red-hot iron seared into Marcus's forehead, marking him permanently as a transgressor. The nobles applauded the spectacle with the same enthusiasm they might show for a particularly skillful juggling act. For them, the pain and degradation of another human being was simply another form of entertainment, no different from watching trained bears dance or exotic birds perform tricks. The psychological torture that accompanied these physical punishments was often more devastating than the beatings themselves. Marcus was forced to thank his tormentors for their correction, to express gratitude for the lesson in proper behavior. He was required to maintain his jester persona, even while being tortured, to find humor in his own agony. "Come now, fool," Lord Blackmore taunted, as the branding iron was returned to the fire. "Surely you can find something amusing about your situation. Are you not the court entertainer?" Marcus, his face contorted with pain, managed to gasp out a response. "Indeed, my lord. I find it amusing that I have finally found a way to get a warm reception from your lordship." The forced wit drew more laughter from the audience, but Marcus's eyes reflected the death of something essential within him. Each time he was compelled to participate in his own degradation, a piece of his humanity was stripped away. The motley he wore was not just a costume, but a uniform of surrender, marking his complete capitulation to a system that viewed his suffering as sport. The entertainment continued late into the night. Marcus was subjected to a series of increasingly elaborate humiliations designed to test the limits of both his endurance and the audience's appetite for cruelty. He was forced to eat scraps from the floor like a dog, while nobles threw bones at him. He was made to crawl on hands and knees, barking like a hound while children kicked him for sport. He was required to perform sexual acts with farm animals while the court watched and laughed. Each degradation was carefully calibrated to maximize entertainment value while keeping Marcus alive and conscious. The nobles had invested time and resources in training him, and they wanted to extract full value from their property. Death would end the show too quickly. Madness might make him less responsive to commands. The goal was to break his spirit completely while maintaining his ability to perform. The social dynamics of these torture sessions revealed the complex hierarchies of medieval court life. Nobles competed to suggest more creative forms of abuse, demonstrating their sophistication and imagination. Servants watched from the periphery, grateful that someone else was bearing the brunt of aristocratic sadism. Even other castle inhabitants, who might normally show sympathy for a fellow sufferer, found themselves laughing along, desperate to avoid becoming targets themselves. The religious justification for such treatment was always available when needed. Marcus's suffering could be framed as punishment for the sin of pride, correction for inappropriate behavior, or simply as part of God's mysterious plan. The castle chaplain, when present at these events, often provided theological commentary that transformed torture into moral instruction. "Behold, the wages of insolence," the chaplain might intone as Marcus writhed in agony. "Let this be a lesson to all who would forget their proper place in God's ordained hierarchy." The aftermath of these entertainments was often as cruel as the events themselves. Marcus would be expected to resume his normal duties immediately, performing with injuries that made movement agony. No medical care would be provided. Healing was expected to occur naturally or not at all. Any signs of lingering resentment or reluctance to perform would trigger fresh rounds of punishment. The psychological conditioning was thorough and effective. Over time, many jesters internalized their abuse so completely that they began to anticipate and even suggest their own punishments. They learned to read their audience's mood and provide whatever level of degradation would satisfy the current appetite for cruelty. This psychological adaptation was both a survival mechanism and a form of suicide, preserving life while destroying the soul. Winter came early to Raven's Hollow that year, and with it came the familiar specter of disease that haunted every medieval castle. But for Godfrey the Fool, the approaching cold meant more than discomfort. It meant the beginning of the end. Godfrey had survived longer than most in his profession, nearly 6 years of service that had left him scarred both physically and mentally. His body bore the accumulated damage of countless entertainments, whip marks that had never properly healed, burns from brandings, and the persistent cough that marked all long-term castle dwellers. But it was the approach of his 40th birthday that truly sealed his fate. Medieval life expectancy for jesters was brutally short. Court records from the period show that most disappeared from employment roles after reaching their late 30s or early 40s. Whether they died, fled, or were simply discarded when their entertainment value declined, the result was the same. They vanished from history without trace or mourning. The winter that would claim Godfrey began with a series of minor symptoms that gradually escalated into a death sentence. The persistent dampness of the castle walls had long since seeped into his bones, creating a chronic ache that worsened with each cold snap. The primitive heating systems filled the air with smoke that irritated his already damaged lungs. The contaminated water and spoiled food that formed his daily diet gradually poisoned his system. But perhaps most devastating was the accumulated psychological trauma that had worn away his will to live. 6 years of systematic dehumanization had taken their toll. Godfrey found himself increasingly unable to summon the energy needed for performance. The wit that had once been sharp now felt forced and hollow. The physical comedy that had saved his life countless times now required effort that his broken body could barely provide. Lord Ravenshollow, now in his 70s and growing increasingly irritable with age, had little patience for a jester who seemed to be losing his edge. The court that had once laughed at Godfrey's antics now watched with critical eyes, always ready to report any failure to amuse. The pressure to perform while sick and exhausted created a vicious cycle that accelerated his decline. The first serious crisis came during a feast celebrating the Lord's grandson's betrothal. Godfrey, weakened by a recent bout of dysentery, stumbled during what should have been a simple tumbling routine. The fall itself was minor, but the laughter that followed was cruel and mocking rather than amused. Lord Ravenshallow's face darkened with displeasure. "Our fool seems to be getting old," the Lord observed coldly. "Perhaps it is time to consider replacements." The threat hung in the air like a sword. Godfrey understood immediately that his usefulness was being questioned. In the brutal calculus of medieval court life, aging jesters were liabilities rather than assets. They ate food, occupied space, and provided diminishing returns on the investment in their training. Desperate to prove his continued value, Godfrey pushed his failing body to perform feats that would have challenged a healthy young man. He attempted increasingly dangerous stunts, hoping to recapture the attention and approval that had kept him alive for so long. But his efforts only emphasized his decline, drawing attention to his limitations rather than his abilities. The court began to whisper about his replacement. Servants spoke of scouts being sent to villages to find new candidates. The castle's entertainment budget was discussed in terms of upgrading the current staff. Godfrey found himself being evaluated like livestock, examined for signs of further decline, and assessed for his remaining useful life. The psychological pressure of living under this scrutiny was immense. Every performance might be his last. Every joke could determine whether he lived another day or was discarded like a broken tool. The chronic stress exacerbated his physical symptoms, creating a downward spiral that became impossible to escape. Sleep became elusive as his anxiety increased. The servants' quarters, already uncomfortable and disease-ridden, felt like a tomb where he waited for execution. The rats that scurried through the walls seemed to mock him with their vitality. The cold that seeped through the stones felt like death itself reaching for him. Food became increasingly difficult to tolerate. His damaged digestive system, weakened by years of poor nutrition and contaminated meals, could no longer process even the simple fare provided to castle staff. He began to lose weight rapidly, his motley hanging loose on his shrinking frame. The bright colors that had once seemed festive now appeared garish against his pale, drawn features. The other castle inhabitants began to treat him differently as his decline became obvious. Servants who had once been friendly grew distant, not wanting to associate with someone marked for disposal. Guards who had previously shown casual respect now regarded him with the indifference reserved for the already dead. Even other entertainers kept their distance, fearing guilt by association. Godfrey's performances became increasingly desperate and erratic. He would attempt material that had once been successful, only to find that his timing was off, his energy insufficient, his presence diminished. The audience, that had once been easily amused, now seemed bored and restless. The laughter that came was often mocking rather than appreciative. The end came with sudden swiftness. During a particularly cold February evening, Godfrey collapsed while attempting to entertain guests from a neighboring castle. His body, weakened by malnutrition, disease, and exhaustion, simply gave out. He fell to the stone floor with a sound that echoed through the suddenly silent hall. For a moment, the assembled nobles stared at the motionless figure in the bright clothing. Then Lord Ravenshallow spoke with casual indifference. "Remove that, and send word to find a replacement." Godfrey was still breathing when the guards dragged him from the hall, but barely. He was taken to a small storage room where broken furniture and other discarded items were kept. No medical care was provided. No effort was made to ease his suffering. He was simply left to die alone, forgotten as soon as he was out of sight. The death throes lasted 3 days. Godfrey drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes calling out for water that never came, sometimes speaking to family members who had died years earlier. His motley, still clinging to his emaciated frame, gradually became soiled with the final indignities of human mortality. When death finally claimed him, it was discovered only because the smell became noticeable. A servant, sent to retrieve stored items, found the body and reported it with the same emotion one might use to announce a broken barrel or spoiled grain. There was no funeral, no ceremony, no acknowledgement of a life ended. Godfrey's body was thrown into a common grave outside the castle walls, along with other discarded refuse. His motley was stripped away before burial. The valuable fabric would be recycled for the next jester. Within hours, all trace of his existence had been erased. The entertainment continued that very evening with a traveling minstrel, and Godfrey's name was never spoken again. His replacement arrived within a week, a young man with a twisted spine and eager eyes who had no idea what awaited him. The cycle began anew, as it had countless times before, and would countless times again. The bells on the new jester's cap jingled merrily as he was led to his first performance, their sound masking the echoes of all the suffering that had come before. The siege of Carrickmont Castle began with the arrival of King Edward's army on a mist-shrouded morning in the autumn of 1305. From the battlements, the defenders could see the massive baggage train stretching back to the horizon, carrying the components of the most fearsome siege engines ever assembled. Among them, still in pieces but already inspiring terror, was the legendary Warwolf, a trebuchet so massive that its construction would require 50 workmen and 5 master carpenters. Aldwin the Fool watched the approaching army with growing dread. He had served Lord Carrick for 3 years, long enough to understand that sieges meant death for everyone trapped within the walls, but especially for those whose primary value lay in their ability to carry messages between warring leaders. The summons came before the siege engines were even fully assembled. Lord Carrick, his face grim with the knowledge of what was to come, handed Aldwin a sealed parchment with hands that trembled slightly. "You will carry our terms to King Edward," the Lord commanded, though his eyes could not quite meet Aldwin's. "Tell him we are prepared to negotiate a conditional surrender." Aldwin understood immediately that he was being sent to his death. The terms his lord proposed were so insulting to royal authority that they amounted to a formal declaration of defiance. But a jester's role was not to question orders, only to obey them. The journey across the battlefield to the royal camp was a procession through hell. The ground between the armies was littered with the debris of war, broken weapons, abandoned equipment, and the bodies of those who had already paid the ultimate price for their lord's ambitions. Aldwin's motley, bright and colorful against the gray devastation, made him a conspicuous target for archers on both sides. King Edward received him in a pavilion that served as a mobile throne room. The monarch, known to history as the Hammer of the Scots, was in his element surrounded by the implements of war. Maps covered every surface, showing the disposition of forces and the planned deployment of siege engines. The Warwolf itself was visible through the tent's opening, its massive frame taking shape as workers labored to assemble the instrument of destruction. "So," the king said after reading Lord Carrick's terms, his voice dangerously quiet, Your master believes he can dictate conditions to his rightful sovereign. Aldwin tried to explain that he was merely the messenger, but Edward silenced him with a gesture. Around them, the king's advisors and military commanders watched with expressions that promised violence. "Tell me, fool," Edward continued, "do you know what we call subjects who refuse their king's lawful commands?" "Rebels, your majesty," Aldwin whispered, understanding that he was about to become an object lesson in royal justice. "Indeed," Edward smiled coldly. "And do you know what we do with rebels?" Before Aldwin could answer, the king gestured toward the partially constructed werewolf. "You will carry our response to your master, but not, I think, in the manner you expected." The preparation of the werewolf for Aldwin's final journey was a masterpiece of medieval military engineering and psychological warfare. The massive trebuchet, when completed, stood nearly 60 feet tall and required a counterweight of several tons to achieve maximum range. The throwing arm alone was over 30 feet long, designed to hurl projectiles weighing up to 300 pounds for distances that could exceed 300 yards. But this day, the werewolf would launch something more terrible than stone. Aldwin was bound and placed in the machine's launching basket, positioned so that he would survive the initial acceleration, long enough to deliver Edward's message in the most graphic manner possible. The calculation was precise. Too much force would kill him instantly. Too little would fail to demonstrate the engine's awesome power. King Edward had ordered the construction of a special viewing platform for the ladies of his court, ensuring that they would have an excellent view of the demonstration. The destruction of a human being was considered suitable entertainment for noble women, a theatrical display of royal power that would be remembered and discussed for years to come. The mechanics of the trebuchet were elegantly simple, yet devastatingly effective. When the trigger was released, the massive counterweight plummeted earthward, yanking the throwing arm upward with tremendous force. The sudden acceleration subjected anything in the basket to forces that could crush bones and rupture internal organs. For Aldwin, strapped into the launching mechanism, the experience would be like being struck by a giant's fist. The moment of release was carefully timed for maximum psychological impact. Edward waited until the defenders of Carrickmont could be seen watching from their battlements before giving the signal. The werewolf groaned and creaked as the counterweight fell, its massive timbers straining under forces that could breach the strongest fortress walls. Aldwin's scream was cut short by the brutal acceleration. His body, suddenly subjected to forces beyond human endurance, was transformed from living messenger to airborne projectile in the space of a heartbeat. The bright colors of his motley streamed behind him like a banner as he arced through the gray sky, a human comet trailing fabric and blood. The impact, when it came, was both spectacular and horrifying. Aldwin's body struck the castle's outer wall with enough force to leave a visible stain on the stone. The message was unmistakable. King Edward's response to Lord Carrick's terms was written in the shattered remains of his own messenger. But the werewolf's hunger was far from satisfied. Over the following days, Edward ordered the construction of additional trebuchets, each designed to hurl different types of projectiles at the besieged castle. Dead horses were catapulted over the walls to spread disease among the defenders. Barrels of flaming pitch created fires that could not be extinguished. Massive stones pulverized sections of the fortifications with each impact. The siege became a laboratory for testing the limits of siege engine technology. Edward's engineers experimented with different counterweight ratios, varying the trajectory angles and calculating the optimal projectile weights for maximum destruction. Each shot was an exercise in applied physics, a deadly mathematics lesson written in stone and blood. The defenders of Carrickmont, already demoralized by the graphic fate of their messenger, found themselves trapped in a fortress that was being methodically reduced to rubble. The constant bombardment made sleep impossible, food preparation dangerous, and movement between sections of the castle potentially fatal. The psychological warfare was as effective as the physical destruction. Lord Carrick, watching his stronghold crumble under the relentless assault, finally understood the futility of resistance. But by then, Edward had invested too much in the siege to accept anything less than unconditional surrender. The werewolf and its smaller companions continued their deadly work, demonstrating the new reality of medieval warfare, where no fortress was truly impregnable. When Carrickmont finally fell, the survivors emerged to find a landscape transformed by the power of the siege engines. The castle that had stood for generations was reduced to broken stone and shattered dreams. Lord Carrick himself was hanged for rebellion, but his death was almost anticlimactic after the spectacular destruction that had preceded it. The werewolf, having demonstrated its terrible effectiveness, was carefully disassembled and transported to the next siege. Its reputation would precede it, striking fear into defenders who knew that their stone walls offered no protection against Edward's mechanical monsters. The age of the impregnable fortress was ending, brought to a close by engines that could reduce any human construction to rubble. Aldwin's death, meanwhile, was forgotten almost immediately. He was just another jester who had served his purpose and been discarded. No songs would be sung about his brief flight through the Scottish sky. No monuments erected to mark his passing. He had become what all jesters ultimately became, a footnote in someone else's story, remembered only for the manner of his destruction. The great hall of Thornwick Castle fell silent as Sir Roderick the Black entered, his armor still bearing the mud and blood of the battlefield. The assembled nobles, who had been enjoying an evening of entertainment, instinctively shrank back from the knight's presence. His reputation for cruelty was legendary, and his arrival could only mean that someone was about to suffer. Piers the Fool, who had been juggling flaming torches for the crowd's amusement, felt his blood turn to ice as the knight's eyes fixed upon him. He had known this moment would come eventually. All jesters did. The only question was whether death would be quick or slow, public or private, merciful or designed for maximum entertainment value. You, Sir Roderick pointed at Piers with a gauntleted hand, are accused of sedition. The charge was absurd, and everyone in the hall knew it. Piers had been performing the same routine for months, a harmless bit of physical comedy that involved mimicking the mannerisms of various court officials. But in the paranoid atmosphere of medieval court life, any jest could be reinterpreted as dangerous criticism. "My lord," Piers began, his voice trembling, "I meant no disrespect to anyone." "Silence," Sir Roderick roared. "Your mockery of his lordship's counsel has been noted and reported. Justice must be served." The trial that followed was a grotesque parody of legal proceedings. Piers was not permitted to speak in his own defense, nor was he allowed to call witnesses. The evidence against him consisted entirely of Sir Roderick's interpretation of his performances. The verdict was predetermined, the sentence already decided. "Death," Sir Roderick announced with satisfaction, "but not the quick death of the headsman's axe. This fool will die as he lived, providing entertainment for his betters." What followed was a carefully orchestrated spectacle designed to extract maximum suffering while prolonging the victim's agony for the audience's pleasure. Piers was stripped of his motley and chained to a wooden frame in the center of the hall. Hot irons were brought from the kitchens, their metal glowing red with heat. The torture began slowly, methodically. Each application of the red-hot iron drew screams that echoed off the stone walls, creating a symphony of agony that the assembled nobles found deeply satisfying. They placed bets on how long Piers would remain conscious, on which burns would heal and which would fester, on whether he would beg for mercy or maintain his dignity until the end. "Dance for us, fool," Sir Roderick commanded as the heated metal seared Piers's flesh. "Show us your finest performance." The cruelty of the demand was exquisite in its sadism. Even while being tortured to death, Piers was expected to maintain his role as entertainer. His screams were required to sound amusing rather than agonized, his writhing to appear comedic rather than desperate. The line between performance and reality dissolved completely in the crucible of his suffering. Hours passed as the torture continued. Piers's body became a canvas of burns and cuts, each mark precisely placed to maximize pain while avoiding immediate fatality. The audience remained enthralled throughout, their appetite for cruelty apparently inexhaustible. Some had food brought so they could dine while watching the spectacle. "Tell us a joke, fool," one of the noble ladies called out during a brief pause in the proceedings. "Surely you can find something amusing about your situation." Piers, barely conscious and delirious with pain, somehow found the strength to respond. "My lady," he gasped, "I find it amusing that I have finally found a way to warm this cold castle." The weak jest drew laughter from the crowd, but it also marked the end of Piers's resistance. The final flicker of his personality, the last vestige of the human being he had once been, died with those words. What remained was purely a body in torment, performing its final function as an object of entertainment. The end, when it finally came, was almost anticlimactic. Piers's heart, weakened by shock and blood loss, simply stopped beating. His body sagged against the chains that held him upright, the bright burns on his flesh already beginning to fade as his blood cooled. "Remove this," Sir Roderick commanded with the same tone he might use to order the disposal of kitchen scraps, "and clean up the mess." The body was dragged from the hall and thrown into a pit outside the castle walls, along with other refuse. No prayers were said, no ceremonies conducted. Piers simply ceased to exist, his death noteworthy only for the entertainment value it had provided. The nobles returned to their festivities immediately, calling for wine to wash away the taste of smoke and blood. A traveling minstrel was summoned to provide music for dancing. The evening continued as if nothing significant had occurred. Within days, a replacement had been found. A young man with a club foot who had been recruited from a nearby village. He was given Piers's old motley, hastily cleaned of bloodstains, and ordered to begin performing immediately. The cycle continued without pause or reflection. Sir Roderick's reputation was enhanced by the evening's entertainment. He was praised for his creativity in devising such an engaging spectacle. Invitations to other courts followed, each seeking to benefit from his expertise in extracting maximum amusement from human suffering. The new jester, meanwhile, learned quickly that survival depended on complete submission to the arbitrary whims of his masters. He studied the stains on his costume, understanding that they represented the fate that awaited him if he failed to please. The bells on his cap jingled nervously as he practiced his routines, each sound a reminder of the precarious nature of his existence. The hall where Piers had died was cleaned and decorated for the next feast. Fresh rushes covered the bloodstains on the floor. New tapestries hung on the walls to muffle the echoes of screaming. The instruments of torture were cleaned and stored away, ready for the next time entertainment required the ultimate sacrifice. But the memory of that night would linger in the minds of all who witnessed it. Servants would whisper about it in the kitchens. Guards would reference it when discussing the price of disobedience. The new jester would be reminded of it whenever his performance seemed to lag. Piers the Fool had achieved the only immortality available to his profession. He had become a cautionary tale, a reminder of what happened to those who forgot their place in the brutal hierarchy of medieval society. His name would be remembered for as long as it took to train his replacement, and then it too would fade into the silence that claimed all those who wore the motley. The bells that had once announced his arrival now sang for another, but their tune remained the same. A funeral dirge for human dignity, a lament for lives traded away for momentary amusement. In the end, that was all any jester could hope for, to be remembered just long enough for someone else to take their place in the theater of cruelty that was medieval court life. In the year of our Lord 1485, as the medieval world drew to its close, and new ideas about human dignity began to stir in Renaissance minds, an old man sat alone in a damp corner of Westminster Palace. His name was Edmund, though few remembered it, and he bore the distinction of being perhaps the last of the old-style jesters, those broken souls who had traded their humanity for survival in halls of stone and cruelty. Edmund's body was a map of suffering, each scar a story of entertainment extracted from pain. His back bore the marks of countless whippings administered for the amusement of nobles. His hands were gnarled from injuries sustained during comic mishaps. His face carried the permanent damage of repeated beatings disguised as slapstick comedy. At 73, he had somehow survived 4 decades in a profession that typically killed its practitioners within 5 years. The world around him was changing. The brutal certainties of feudalism were giving way to new forms of government and social organization. Courts were becoming more sophisticated, entertainment more refined. The crude spectacles of human degradation that had defined medieval amusement were falling out of fashion among the educated nobility. But Edmund remained, a living relic of a dying age. He sat each day in his corner, ignored by the bustling court officials who had no time for an obsolete entertainer. His motley, faded and patched beyond recognition, hung loose on his emaciated frame. The bells on his cap, once bright and merry, now rang with a hollow sound that seemed to echo from the grave. Young courtiers would occasionally notice him and ask about his function. What purpose does the old fool serve? They would wonder. The answer, when it came from older members of the court, was always the same. He serves as a reminder of how we used to be. Edmund himself had long since ceased to speak, unless directly commanded. The years of performing on cue had conditioned him to respond only to specific stimuli. He would nod when addressed, shuffle his feet when music played, and occasionally produce a weak smile when someone seemed to expect entertainment. But the spark of personality that had once animated his performances was extinct. His memories, when they came, were fragments of horror that his mind had learned to bury. He remembered faces, nobles who had laughed while he suffered, servants who had helped administer punishments, other jesters who had died in his place. But the details were mercifully blurred, softened by time and the protective mechanisms of a psyche that had endured too much. Sometimes, late at night, when the palace grew quiet, Edmund would hear phantom sounds. The laughter of long-dead nobles echoed in empty halls. The screams of fellow jesters who had not survived their final performances rang in his ears. The jingling of bells from motley costumes worn by the forgotten dead provided a ghostly soundtrack to his sleepless nights. The other palace inhabitants treated him with a mixture of pity and superstition. Some believed that his survival was unnatural, that he had made some dark bargain to cheat death for so long. Others saw him as a good luck charm, proof that even the most abused could endure if they surrendered completely to their fate. Most simply ignored him, stepping around his corner, as they might avoid any other piece of decaying furniture. Food came irregularly, usually scraps from the kitchens when someone remembered his existence. Edmund ate whatever was provided, without complaint or preference. His digestive system, damaged by decades of spoiled food and contaminated water, could barely process even simple fare. He had learned to survive on almost nothing, his body consuming itself to maintain minimal function. The approach of winter brought special terrors for Edmund. His aged body could no longer generate sufficient heat to combat the palace's eternal chill. The damp that seeped through the ancient stones settled in his joints, creating agony that would have been unbearable if he had not long since learned to dissociate from physical sensation. He would wrap himself in the tattered remains of old tapestries, creating a cocoon that provided minimal warmth and complete isolation from the world. Medical care was non-existent. The palace physicians had no interest in treating a superannuated entertainer whose function had ended decades earlier. Edmund's various ailments, the persistent cough, the failing eyesight, the tremor in his hands, were simply accepted as inevitable consequences of age and a life of abuse. Pain was his constant companion, as familiar and unwelcome as the memories that haunted his dreams. As 1485 progressed and the year of Bosworth Field approached, even the minimal attention Edmund received began to fade. The court was focused on matters of state and succession. Wars were being fought, alliances forged, and futures decided by men who had no time for echoes from the past. Edmund's corner grew quieter as foot traffic diverted to more important corridors. On a particularly cold November evening, as snow began to fall outside the palace windows, Edmund felt the approach of his final performance. His breathing, always labored, became increasingly difficult. His heart, weakened by decades of stress and malnutrition, began to skip beats. The end, when it came, would be neither dramatic nor observed. He died as he had lived his final years, alone, ignored, forgotten. His body was discovered 3 days later by a servant who noticed the smell. There was no ceremony, no announcement, no marking of his passage. He was buried in an unmarked grave outside the palace walls, along with other discarded refuse. The motley that had defined his existence was thrown onto a fire, the bright fabric crackling as it was consumed by flames. The bells from his cap were given to a palace cat, who wore them briefly before losing interest. Within a week, all physical trace of Edmund's existence had been erased. But perhaps most telling was what happened next. Nothing. The palace continued to function without him. Entertainment was provided by musicians and actors who maintained their dignity while they performed. No one inquired about the old fool who had occupied the corner. No one noticed his absence. Edmund had achieved the ultimate fate of all jesters, to vanish without leaving any mark on the world beyond the suffering he had endured. His story, like those of countless others who had worn the motley, died with him. The bells that had announced his presence fell silent forever. In the centuries that followed, historians would write about medieval courts with romantic nostalgia. They would describe the colorful characters who had entertained nobles, portraying jesters as witty figures who spoke truth to power. The reality, the systematic dehumanization, the casual cruelty, the slow death of human dignity, would be forgotten or romanticized beyond recognition. But in quiet moments, when wind whistles through ancient stone and shadows gather in forgotten corners, some say you can still hear them. The bells of the dead, jingling softly in halls where laughter once covered screams. The ghosts of fools who traded their souls for survival, still performing for audiences that no longer exist. Their lament echoes through the centuries, a reminder of what happens when human beings are reduced to objects of amusement. It speaks of lives wasted, dignity destroyed, and suffering transformed into entertainment for those who believed their power placed them above basic human decency. The bells toll for all of them: Willem, Thomas, Marcus, Godfrey, Aldwin, Piers, Edmund, and the countless others whose names were never recorded. They ring for every person, forced to smile while being broken, to laugh while dying, to entertain while their humanity was slowly stripped away. In the end, that may be their only monument, the memory of suffering that should never be forgotten, the echo of bells that should never ring again. For in remembering their pain, we honor not just their sacrifice, but our obligation to ensure that such cruelty remains buried in the past where it belongs. The last bell has tolled. The final performance is ended. The stage is empty now, and may it remain so forever. Thus ends the chronicle of those who wore the motley in medieval times, not heroes or villains, but human beings caught in a system that ground them to dust for the amusement of others. Their story serves as a reminder that behind every laugh, extracted through cruelty, lies a soul in torment, and that the price of entertainment should never be measured in human suffering. May their bells ring no more, and may their peace, so long denied in life, finally be found in death.